Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 115, and the topic is the next big challenge of AI agents, access and authentication. Our guest today is Paresh Bhaya, co-founder of Natoma. Welcome, Paresh.
Thank you, Mike. Excited here to talk about this. It is indeed like the next big challenge. All of us have been struggling with it, and especially the folks wearing the identity hat. This is going to become quite big and huge from my perspective, at least.
Yeah, so before we dive into it, not all the Identity out there know who you are. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your backstory and how you came to found Natoma or
Uh,
co-found Natoma?
yeah, no, thanks, Mike. Of course, not even close to the kind of great following you have. I've been personally following you as well. My background, I mean, engineer by education, was sitting here. If you think about it, like when I started off my career, I was kind of sitting there coding. I was in network security. And along the way, this is way before vibe coding was there. Along the way, it was a very organic transition into product management and architect role where, funny story, one AE comes in, walks in looking for the founders and stuff. And he's like, "Hey, Paresh, you know the product. Let's go talk to the customer." And ended up talking to the customer. And since then, they were like, "Oh, every single call, Paresh needs to be there." It was a small company. We were like 14, 15 people back then. And that kind of transitioned me away. I really enjoyed it. I was like, okay, I think I suck at coding anyways. Let me go into product management, do product marketing, that kind of transitioned into more cloud at Salesforce. I was a operator at Salesforce, like it was reporting into the CISO, worked under the CTO of security very closely, a big, massive mentor. That's where I learned all the ropes around security, identity, and then it landed up at Okta, and I was kind of leading the product strategy PMM at Okta. And that's where I saw this challenge of AI agents and this access for AI agents, and ended up starting Natoma in December 23. And since then, a little over a year and a half now, trying to figure this out and working with good customers.
Yeah, so actually, this is a good place to start, a good lead into where we want to start, because there's a number of NHI startups, non-human identity startups, and
Yep.
Natoma is one of the more renowned ones. Um, but maybe you can just tell me in a nutshell, what business problem does Natoma solve?
No, that's awesome, right? I mean, if I take a step back, generally, the way I've seen the NHI space problem is like the ones which are kind of doing that discovery and governance of the world, and like, hey, look at service accounts and kind of things like that. Then there is this second bucket around like, hey, how do you become like the IAM for NHI and for these APIs and things like that. Where we kind of shine and differentiate is we are ultra focused on AI agents, and how do you detect shadow AI? How do you make sure these AI agents can get the right level of access to your enterprise data, enterprise tools, and also like how do you make sure the policy enforcement, the fine-grained authorization, the user interacting with these agents, making sure that their access on the downstream side is well understood and they get only the things that they are getting access to. Because we are not there today yet, but we are getting to a world where these agents will be autonomous and they will be working on behalf of you. So that authentication, that authorization becomes super, super critical. And that is the massive focus on ensuring like these agents can talk to, have the right level of permissions, can talk to the right enterprise data, and how the human interacting or on behalf of you, how are they interacting? And then, of course, we're getting into a world of like agent to agent interactions, which are also in a way non-human identities, and then have this world of like domain specific agents and one agent calling another agent. And that A to A protocol kind of really comes in. How do we solve for that problem?
So the topic of today, let me put the topic back on,
Yeah.
is the next big challenge of AI agents, access and authentication. Um, and those are two sort of different areas. And authentication, and there's probably a step before that, which is identity.
Yep.
So how do we maybe issue a URI to each agent or each workload, let's say, so that we know when it registers, how it identifies itself, what's its username. And then ideally, I would say we would like these AI agents to use some type of asymmetric authentication. We want to move away from shared secrets. So I do agree that agent authentication is a big challenge. Once an agent asserts itself and wants to say, okay, we have a session here, we've done business before, you know me, I'm this one. Um, I want to authenticate myself, hopefully doing some type of proof of possession of a public
Yep.
key, of a private key, where I'm sending you some signed challenge back, but not using API key and secret anymore. Shared secrets are, we should have moved away from those a long time ago. And then finally, now that my AI agent has identified itself and can authenticate itself asymmetrically, finally we want to talk about how do we make policies about this agent, and how do we say, how are we going to delegate authority from one person to another or from a person to an AI agent? And how is that, the constraints of that going to flow down to the data level? Because the data itself might be tagged to have certain obligations or rights, in how it can be used. So this is a lot of like surface area.
Yeah.
Um, and then, but actually, before I pivot into the problem, I want to talk a little bit about some of the components. So that we have this new component called the MCP server.
Yep.
Um, so I want to actually pivot back to a question about, what is that? What does the MCP server say about this? Where we are in that evolution of the security that we need to really do this agentic AI delegation properly? And why are people so excited about the MCP server? And I'm going to give my sort of layman's like analysis and ask the question: do you see the MCP server as the equivalent of the CGI bin? In the old days of the internet, it's a place where you can execute code, but it's fairly neutral on what happens in there. And that's a metaphor that Rohit Kar mentioned
Yeah.
previously to me at an IAW, but it's always kind of stuck with me. So pivoting first to MCP before we even go into identity authentication and access.
No, that's just such a interesting way to put it from that CGI perspective. And like, if you put our hats back and like the web server and CGI and the security challenges that kind of opened up. But the way I personally think about this MCP, it's a game changer. Why do I say it's a game changer? Think about I mean, the way this traditional AI to Gen AI journey has been, right? Like when this all started by the Google Brain team kind of figuring out the research around transformer models and stuff. And then like OpenAI kind of came about and created like your chat GPT, and like boom, overnight Gen AI was like this uh, massive growth, right? And that was the basis from that traditional machine learning AI to Gen AI. So what do I mean by that? Like AI is not new, right? I mean, we all know we've been doing AI for 15 plus years. But what was that change was like, if I was actually talking to somebody over the weekend, my cousin's a doctor, and I was kind of explaining it to her about this, and I think this analogy would be quite interesting. It's like, let's say you have, she was telling me that, oh, I have this AI in healthcare forever. We can take these images of like, hey, look at this image of lung and detect that image and say, hey, this person has a lung cancer. That is sort of AI. So what is new? Where that change from traditional AI to Gen AI is broad. you can actually go and detect, looking at an image, that this person has lung cancer. But it also goes and now tells you, based on this, based on the other data inputs that have been there in these GPT pre-trained transformer models, that now this person is very susceptible to pneumonia and can have, like, certain other conditions. So you kind of go from like just looking at the image and detecting to really predicting what could potentially happen, right? And the beauty of these LLMs is they kind of are, like, working really well. But the bigger problem comes in is, how do you really unlock the power of these things, right? They were great for consumer use cases. We all have used ChatGPT. We all kind of like upload a document, hey, summarize this for me, or write me an email to something like that, or give me some. So those kind of consumer use cases was awesome. Like the use case that comes to mind was from the Apple Intelligence Worldwide, the WWDC conference, right? They kind of said that, hey, Apple Intelligence, go and tell me what's the status of when is my mom landing. What does it do? It goes and checks in your email, sees the flight of your mom, goes to Google or search and figures out when it is
Yeah.
landing and gives you that information, right? So that consumer use case is awesome. But now, to really unlock that power of AI, Gen AI in enterprises, you need to start connecting to your enterprise data, right? Enterprise data is your IP. That is where it can really come in and try proving game changer. And this is where I feel MCP shines. It is like a native way to connect your enterprise data into your LLM models and making them smarter in a way. Now it can really start interacting your tools, your data sets. And the best part of it is, as you might folks might already know, the massive difference compared to an API versus like MCP, two big differences that come to mind. One is, when you have, let's say, 10 agents and you have 10 different data sources, you are going into 10 cross 10, M cross N integrations. Each agent build all that APIs, build all that integration. You go into the next agent, you have to redo all of those things. What with the MCP changes from that perspective is goes from 10 cross 10 or M cross N to M plus N, right? Like now you have these servers and now you can have an agent. And once you build that server for your data source, you can have as many number of agents going and talking to that server. So it goes from that M cross N to M plus N. And the second biggest
It's
benefit,
lowering the friction of in calling AI services, basically. Um,
absolutely, absolutely. And the second biggest benefit that
it's sort of
unlocks,
like the CGI bin, where instead of us saying you're going to send us the data and we're going to figure out how to run it, you could say just call this program with parameters, and we'll be able to parse it.
yeah,
So the
yep,
CGI bin analogy is sort of holding up here.
yeah,
But let's not forget how important the CGI bin was. Executable applications, give us the modern web, I
yeah,
guess, or at
absolutely.
least the server
Other
side modern web.
The other benefit of MCP that really unlocks the execution and speed of AI adoption, in my opinion, is this what they call as the dynamic self-discovery, right? We've all built apps, or we might not have built agents, but we all build apps. Now you have this app, you want to go call certain post and update and get API calls. You go and try to do this for a different data source, you have to rewrite the code and stuff like that. Where this dynamic self-discovery comes in is, the agent comes in, no changes to the agent code, nothing doing. Because it's an MCP client, it can detect like what tools it has access to, and it can runtime add boot up, figure out everything that it has access to. And that again really speeds up the deployment, and that will help unlock the power of this Gen AI in enterprise, like really with enterprise data, in my opinion.
Um,
But
now,
which, going back to CGI win though,
yeah,
this it's massive game changer, makes a lot of sense. But then there is like, a lot of security challenges comes in, right? Uh, we are always like with new technology, we get excited, new protocol, we get excited, we want to move fast, but then there's always new attack surface, which is coming with these MCP servers and things like that. But
Yeah.
we will hold on to that thought before we move on. But like a lot of new challenges
Yeah,
there.
to just comment on that a little bit, um, there was a talk at Identiverse,
Mm,
um, and one of the speakers from Amazon mentioned capabilities equals risk, and MCP is a new capability, and certainly every MCP service you offer gives with those capabilities comes new risks, for
absolutely.
sure. Um, I want to pivot. This live stream goes faster than you think. So I
Yeah.
want to pivot into. Actually, I'll talk for 1 second more into the topic here of access and authentication, which
Mm.
is topics near and dear to my heart. So these are my favorite topics. But before we dive into that, I actually want to start with identification, and I'm putting you on the spot here because we didn't prepare this question ahead of time. Um, but I would think that AI agents identify themselves via a URI of some kind. But I don't know what that URI should be. Is it the address of their discovery endpoint? Is it like Spiffy issues URIs and maybe can host some of those URI identifiers? What do you have any thoughts whatsoever on what URI you would use to identify an AI agent?
That's a great point. I think that Spiffy model does work well. It will definitely agree with you. These AI agents do need identity. They need to identify themselves and go interact. So if you think about like, uh, these agents now human interacting with that agents and these agents now acting on behalf of the agents. So
Yeah.
that Spiffy comes in. The other one that comes to mind is this agent card concept, which was kind of by Google uh, from an agent to agent protocol, right? We spoke about MCP, but Google's take is like, hey, everybody's building agents. You will have domain specific agents. These domain specific agents might talk to itself. So agent to agent needs to talk to each other. And that is where they have come up. They are building on OIDC, but they
Uh-huh.
have this concept of agent card. And that agent card is sort of loosely defined URI, where the
Uh-huh.
agent card is identifies like this is the agent I am, and that is what I identifies those agents in a way. And that concept needs to carry over, you know.
And in the Google model, so the way the Spiffy model is okay, if the Spiffy server is issuing URIs that it hosts, it's like
Yeah,
a registry in a way. Um, and or it could be a federated model where like in OpenID Connect, you use the well-known OpenID configuration endpoint
yeah,
as the issuer identifier if it's an OP, but the RP doesn't normally have an identifier because in OpenID, the RP gets a client ID, but that's always domain specific. Um, and so, but technically during registration, the RP could assert an identifier, a URI identifier, maybe one it obtained via Spiffy, or maybe this RP is internet accessible and has a stable RP identifier. Anyway, I'll move on, but I just wanted to
no,
raise that point that identification and this issue is coming around in the wallet world because ideally we would like an instance of a wallet to be able to also insert its identity in a stable way across domains, not have a domain specific identifier like a client ID. Um, okay, so let's move to authentication then. So let's say now we know how to identify our client or our workload or our AI agent, our piece of software acting on our behalf. What's the next step? How do you see this agent or this piece of software actually authenticating itself? Do we use OAuth there? Do we use Whimsy? Is there some other mechanism, PKI, MTLS?
No, I would say OAuth, right? I mean, OAuth is very well adopted. You should be able to leverage these agents and authenticate these agents through OAuth, right? You don't need to uh, like reinvent the wheel there. And also, and one of the things that initial MCP server, the client server protocol was designed was like, hey, the MCP server needs to be from an OAuth perspective, support both authorization server as well as like a resource server. I don't think that that has already changed, by the way. So the newer protocol is adopting the OAuth 2.1 there. So essentially, you should be able to leverage every enterprise today has an IDP. You need an IDP for your human side of things, and these IDPs do support authorization servers. So why not these agents when they are trying to get authentication and trying to go access your enterprise data, leverage those IDPs, redirect them to the IDP, get the authorization, like get the token, do the authentication, get the token, and then come to the server as a resource server and then accept the token from that perspective. So I think OAuth is the right approach personally, but would love to learn your thoughts. What do you think?
I'm going to actually ask more questions before but I'll make one suggestion. Well, I wonder about Whimsy
Mm,
because apparently Whimsy has more adoption than I realized. I thought it was an early spec, but
that's
actually a number of large consumer services are in such a rush for such a solution that Whimsy is already widely deployed. Whimsy involves issuing a new type of proof of possession token. Um, so
mm,
my one question is about Whimsy, but if we stay on OAuth for a second, because I'm with you on OAuth as being the logical way to register a piece of software in a cross-domain federated area. And so, however, one of the challenging things is that when a client uses OAuth for registration, um, it is needs to prove it's trusted. Um, and so, one way that they do this in the banking ecosystem is somebody issues the software developer something called a software statement, and that
mm.
software statement is presented during registration. It's like a token that allows you to register your software, and then based upon the verification of that token, then that workload might be registered. But I'm just curious. So before we go into Whimsy, if we while we're staying on OAuth, any thoughts about what is the process, the business process, and the technical process by which you think clients would register if they're going to use OAuth?
I think it should be based on the like like once you provide an identity to these, it will be based on like when the call happens, and if it an identity is even for the end use the enterprise data or the server or the access point might know where the authentication is coming from. But you just say that hey, you need to go and it needs to be registered in your IDP, get that authentication, and come from there.
Yeah. So it's almost like the registration becomes part of the CI/CD process
Correct.
rather than I'm requested the developer saying, "Oh, I'd like to call your API." We need more automation, especially when it comes to AI agents. So
Mm.
dynamic client registration, Spiffy has a way to register also through let's say Aspire server, which is one of the implementations. And I think that involves really just getting the identifier, the Swiffy URI, and perhaps a certificate, which can be used for MTLS. But OAuth at client registration gives you more flexibility in terms of what could be in that software statement and what might be in the client entity as content that you might want to use for policy and for issuing tokens. Um, and but when I look at this, I see that companies sort of need a life cycle management for. So in the old days, there'd be a process around how we onboard a user, like joiner
No, yeah.
leaver type of like workflow, um, joiner mover leaver. Now, for in the old days, we would have sort of a pretty controlled process around how we onboarded applications. We'd say,
Yep.
oh, this app supports SAML, and we need to get their metadata, and we need to configure it in our IDP, and we need to test it. And that type of like IT heavy like process isn't going to work today. So I think moving to a more dynamic process like OAuth makes sense. But then we have to figure out how we manage the trust. How do we know that this piece of software using an automated API to register needs to get needs to or should be trusted, and we should allow them to register clients with these client claims. And and so I see software statements as a way to do that, but I almost think like at a business layer, you now need a business process for um, how you enable developers to register their applications, register the capabilities that they want those applications to access, and then have an approval process so that the business people can say, oh, I see this group of developers from this third party wants to call these APIs,
Yeah.
and this is the risk associated with that. Okay, we're going to let them do it. Here's an assertion that they can use for registration, and they can use that in the dev and the prod environment. But it seems like, what I see missing is some of the business flow for how businesses would interact with developers. And especially if those developers are SaaS providers, how is this business model going to scale? And any thoughts of the trust management part seems really tricky here.
Yeah, it is very tricky. I completely agree with you that, like, these identities, you can't just assume, like, not all identities are the same, right? You can't assume the processes that we had for human identities and join them over lever processes of the world can apply to AI agents. Good luck with that. And the second thing I would definitely call out is we really need to be ahead of the game here, right, Mike? In the sense that you cannot get to a point where you don't know, like, with what happened with APIs and stuff. Like, today, industry is kind of figuring out, like, oh, how many API exist, how many of these, uh, like, how many API exist, what's going on. All of those pieces are like, we go and do discovery with AI agents and their identities. There is no way you can actually go and do those discoveries, right? And also there is like a missing granularity also, right? Like how do you allow LLM access to this person's email in a way, right? Like, so the agent identity is important, but now you're getting like these LLMs and getting that access to, right? This is where, uh, like, when you're building these agents which are sort of like on top of these LLMs, this is where MCP kind of helps. And you assign identities to that, you assign identities to the user who's interacting with that, and then you do the OAuth integrations, and then you kind of go about like, uh, providing the right level of access. And that access is also in multi levels, right? Like, you think about access from, like, you have this agent, you identified their identity, you figured out like what, how to provide an identity, but what can it access, which enterprise data, what tools are, like, is it supposed to access your email, is it supposed to access your Salesforce? How do you control that? That's number one piece. Now once you provide that control of what the agent can access, the second piece there goes is, what kind of actions can it take? Can it actually go and delete something? Can it do some CRUD operates? Like, maybe you want to control things like that. And then you kind of go about like, okay, Mike is interacting with that agent. How do you bring in that authorization of Mike into all, right? And
Yeah,
then how,
so I like the direction that you're going here, because, okay, so let's just take it as a given that we're going to be able to figure out a URI for this age piece of software. And let's take it as a given that there's a way using either Whimsy or OAuth for this client to basically register not just an identifier and credentials, but other trusted metadata about itself, like what organization owns it, and what privilege, what capabilities have been granted to it,
Yep.
and potentially other metadata. Like what's really important, I would say, could be like a tenant ID in a multi-tenant situation. Maybe you only have access to your tenant's data, so there might be all sorts of metadata. So again, we'll assume we can identify it. Let's assume it registers it's metadata and some type of secret that enables us to authenticate it. Now we have an AI agent that's making calls to our services, our AI services, our MCP servers, um, and it's presenting tokens that it's obtained to show that it has the right to do certain things in our system because our client could be maybe only calling this one API and it needs a limited scope. It doesn't want to over permission a
Correct.
token. So over time, a client might actually obtain multiple tokens and present them. Also, the tokens are short lived. Um, and so the challenge that I see is that we need to define what kind of tokens these are. Um, and before we can even make the policies about how we should be able to govern the access of these tokens, first I would say we need to define the schema of what are these tokens. And in a way, the tokens are the evidence of the type of authentication, the client authentication that took place, or potentially other evidence. But any thoughts on about like what are the gaps in security today, just with regard to the types of tokens we have, and what would we need to do to even get the tokens into the kind of shape where we could represent the types of delegations that we're talking about. And Yuri has echoed some of your thoughts here about um, how do I give an LLM access to only certain emails from one person,
Right.
um, or before we even get to that type of, we're going to have to present some type of tokens. And do we
Right.
have the tokens today that we need to even get this done?
So yes and no. So some cases we do have it, right? Like, so let's say if I continue that thought of like, okay, this agent's allowed to talk here, this agent can only take that access or that action. And then now we are trying to say, okay, but by the way, this agent, do you have the authority to even take that action? And that is where that tokens comes in. So to answer your question about do these tokens exist? In some cases, if you have like those personal access tokens, GitHub is great from that perspective. You have a pack, you can tie like Mike's pack back into it, and you can do that. But then what about like, we're talking about enterprise and legacy data and systems. Do those legacy systems have the concept of privileged access tokens? Not really. So really need to pull in that information. I think there's some other work going on around in OAuth 2.0 around like the identity assertion authorization grant as well. That will be able to obtain like access token for a third party API in a way, right? So what that means is like my token using this identity assertion authorization grant, my my authorization can be provided to the MCP server, and now the MCP server is actually using that token. So this is a work that is in progress as far as I know, and that will also be super valid and once it gets adopted as part of all.
Yeah, let me say a couple of words about that. I actually
Yeah,
added a link at the last minute. I added a homework link, like 5 minutes before the episode started,
yeah,
with to a proposal to add an extension to MCP to support a specific grant flow. It's a draft grant flow right now at the IETF. Um, and the way that I read this was um, that one of the ways that they want to convey trust is, now if I get a token in my domain and I send you a token in your domain, you might not
yeah,
understand that token. The subject identifier might be different. So So I might be known by my username in my home system and by my email address in the target system. So I've seen a number of proposals around, and maybe they're the same proposal I've seen in different places, um, but where basically you take your token from domain A and you present it in domain B, and
Yeah.
then domain B mints you a new token that you can then present to domain B's APIs. Um, and this is a way to convey the trust because even though I can say, my tokens are trusted, maybe the audience identifier is wrong. Although this could be helped with a stable RPID. Um, and so sometimes there could be issues around, audience validation, and sometimes there could be issues around mapping the username. But in a number of cases, you might want to sort of trade your token using the token exchange mechanism in domain B and get a new token. And that way you can evaluate policies in that new domain. Should I trust that token? And by the way, transaction tokens looks a lot like this too.
Agreed.
Transaction tokens also is using token exchange. And one of my questions is that actually, could we just use transaction tokens for all the above and just define different schemas for the payload of transaction tokens? Um, but any thoughts on, whether these patterns are useful or are they just like a band-aid solution? It would be my question.
No, I think they are very useful, right? I mean, and this is a big, massive problem, right? Like some places you do have paths and you can kind of take that path. But to your question about like these assertion grants, right? That domain A versus domain B. Now, really, like if you think about it, domain A is your application, your services, whatever you are using,
Yeah,
and
or
you are
domain A
get
could be ChatGPT, right? I log into
yeah,
ChatGPT and I want to
absolutely.
call some MCP server connected to ChatGPT. So domain B would be some MCP service, right?
Exactly. But yeah, you through ChatGPT, you want to get into Salesforce, for example, and the MCP server is actually going and calling that. So you need
Hmm.
to provide that token to that domain B, which is the MCP server, and that kind of goes and calls that. So it's not like I'm directly calling it. It's not my token, but I'm kind of passing the authorization to that. And this bit will be very critical, and this will help us really change because, as I said, GitHub supports Pat and you can leverage that. But what about like 80%, 90% of the other ones? They don't really support it. So then, and if you're leveraging MCP servers to connect to your enterprise tools and services, how do you really make sure at that point that the authorization that is given to that API call to that MCP server to the service, it has the right level of authorization, and the user that is using that agent or the agent that's acting in behalf of that user, does that user actually have the, the authorization that the API keyword that was plugged in, right? Now we are exposing like I might not be able to do, let's say, a delete operation, but now through agent I'm able to do a delete operation just because that. Or like, I'm able to, if I take continue on the GitHub example, if I'm just doing like list commits of that, now I might be able to go and do the list commits of repos I may not have access to.
Right. Hopefully
Yeah.
not.
Hopefully not. I mean, that really
Yeah.
changes massively, right? And with these LLMs, like these LLMs are very smart, right? They'll keep working and they'll try to get to an answer. They want to provide an answer to you,
Yeah. Now, I don't know
right?
how GitHub does this, by the way. So Glue has a GitHub app. We have a developer site where we
Yeah.
let you define workflows for authentication. And also, we have a tool called Designer. Both of those tools are GitHub apps. And when you use those apps, you grant permission per repository.
Correct.
Um, and it works really nicely. I love it because I joke that Glue doesn't store any of their files. It's all in GitHub. We're
There
just
you
giving
go.
them a viewer for their own GitHub repos, which is kind of beautiful. Um, but in any case, I don't know how they implement security there. It's in the GitHub app, and I don't know if it's based on OAuth or not. Um, but yeah, I do think GitHub has an interesting use case. Um, And but let's bring it back to Natoma for a second.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so all of this area that we talked about, there's a lot of challenges at every step of this. And so to bring it back to Natoma, how do you think Natoma is going to help businesses? And in what area do you think, sort of will be your unique area that you help solve some business challenges?
Exactly what we've been talking about, right? This is a massive challenge, and this is a challenge which has not been solved. What Natoma really provides is like a hosted MCP platform, and we really help enterprises bring their own LLMs, any agents, be it like no matter what, right? Everybody is supported MCP or any clients like your cursors or co-pilots or whatever AI agent you have. How do you really securely connect to your uh, enterprise data? That's where Natoma really helps. It provides that identity to that agent, make sure that agent is allowed to access, even though when the agent is allowed to access, okay, after that, what actions it's able to take, and then a user interacting with that agent, how they are going to do it. We basically become the policy enforcement point, right? Like now we really become sit for not only simplify all this MCP hosting problems and the MCP security challenges. Like we didn't even get to all the massive security challenges that are coming up with MCP servers. We kind of help you solve some of that and provide that access and authorization and fine-grained authorization and context-aware authorization and provide that policy enforcement point for it.
Okay, well, I can't resist adding this. If you're focusing on the authorization, there's been a number of authorization syntaxes. Rego,
Yeah.
and it's the most well known with 10 million downloads. Styra Open Policy Agent is one of the most common. But of course, there's Cedar, and I've been advocating for Cedar and our local Cedar agent called the Cedarling. And then there's OpenFGA, which is a CNCF graph-based project from Okta, from your ex-colleagues. When you're architecting this, are you using one of these policy approaches? And do you disclose that? And is there, do you see do you have a preference, or do you see one of them as looking like they might emerge as a good solution for you?
It's too early days, very frankly. We are doing trying all of these. We really right now really helping enterprises safely and securely accelerate their AI agent adoption because this MC with this hosted MCP platform, they can really go fast and but provide the right security guardrails around that, right? So generally the mindset has been the identity security is like blocker and not letting adopt. AI changes the game in terms of like how much productivity business value it can bring to an enterprise. What we really help is like let the CISOs, let the identity teams, let the business run as fast as possible, but you get the right guardrails around it. We do provide that policy and policy enforcement. Will it be based on OPA? Will it be based on Cedar? We're starting small, like and kind of continuing to build on top of it. So
Uh-huh. Interesting. Okay. Um, well, I'll put in my 2 cents and say I think it should be Cedar based, because
I
then it'll be
it's strong
deterministic,
candidate.
fast, and human readable. But
Strong candidate for sure. It has to be human readable. But it's
yeah,
again the value that we deliver is like unlock the power of AI agents, accelerate your AI adoption, but have the right security guardrails. Because in this day and age, with this AI thing, you cannot just go extremely fast and then think, oh, I'm going to go fix everything. That's not going to work.
right. So let's actually we're a little bit over on time. And so let me just give you the stage for a minute. Any last thoughts, next things coming up that you want the audience to be aware of?
No, thank you. A lot of things, a lot of excitement. The space is moving very rapidly. A lot of changes coming in, even from like the MCP protocol side. A2A protocol is quite native. My last thoughts here. I mean, I already spoke about Natoma, how we really help you. accelerate AI adoption at enterprises with the right security guardrails. Let's make sure security is not seen as a blocker forever being as an operator. Security was always seen as a blocker. This is a chance where we can become a business enabler. Security becomes a business enabler. But let's do it the right way. And would love to talk, love to learn. The space is too new, moving too fast. Please do reach out.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that was a really interesting episode on a hard topic. So thank you for being in the hot seat. Just want to quickly announce the next episodes. Replays rejected, fortifying microservices against stolen tokens. This was it's a repeat of a talk given at Identiverse, but hopefully we'll have more time than they had at Identiverse to flush out how this team from Yahoo used transaction tokens in a very innovative way. And I thought it was something that was worth shining some light on. So we have Yahoo engineers from around the world joining us on this one. Um, with that, I will say thank you to the audience. Thank you, Paresh, for taking a lot of off the unscheduled questions, and we'll see you next time.
No, thank you, audience, and great. Really enjoyed it. It's always a great learning experience.